Welcome to Pirate Politics, where we prepare for your next political conversation. I'm Jeronimo Cortina, political science professor at the University of Houston.
And I'm Brandon Rottinghaus, also a political science professor here at the University of Houston. Thanks for hanging out and talking politics with us. Well, this week we're going to take a bit of a divergence because we usually talk about sort of what's going on in the world that week. But this week we're going to talk more about what's to come in the primary for the Republicans. We've been talking about this for a couple weeks in general. We talked about the Democrats a few weeks before. If you didn't see it, go back and take a look on YouTube because there's some great stuff there.
Of course.
Yeah, as always. Yes. Mostly from our friend Dr. Cortina, but a couple of observations from me, you know, if you're into that kind of a thing.
Yeah.
But obviously the Republican side of the equation is really important because so many of these races are such that if you win the Republican primary, you're probably going to win the general.
Yep.
But there's still some questions. And so we'll kind of tease out what the primary means with respect to the general and some big picture kind of things about what's going on in the Republican Party politics in Texas, which is always exciting. I had somebody tell me the other week that politics is boring, and I thought, you are not paying nearly close enough attention because the watchword for Republicans going into the primary is chaos. You've got the primaries having been affected by redistricting. You've got Republican Party polling in bad shape. You've got Republicans losing ground with independents, with Gen Z, with Latinos. Trump's underwater in Texas in terms of approval. The Texas economy is in kind of grim shape. Employment has stalled. The percentage of unemployed is basically the same as it is at the national level, which for a long time was not the way. Texas had its own kind of strong economic path. It still to some degree does, but those things are eroding a little bit. All of the major characters, all the major statewide officials are essentially underwater in terms of approval. They're struggling to some degree, maybe more than we've seen in the past, but that doesn't mean they're going to lose these elections because there are a lot of them. And we'll talk about each of them as we go. But given that context, I want to get your thoughts on kind of the big picture about what's happening in Republican Party politics and what it means for the primary.
Well, it's midterm elections. We had this situation in 2018. Then we had the red tsunami that never was a tsunami eventually. And we're seeing that type of tectonic realignments within the Texas Republican Party, but also being significantly shaped by national politics and AKA by President Trump.
Great point.
So I think it's going to be very interesting to see because in many of these races you have a very unique mix of candidates, right?
What does that mean?
A very unique mix.
I like the way you put that diplomatically. But you're right. There are a lot of candidates running, and there's a bunch of divergence in terms of ideology, in terms of experience, and sometimes that's what it's going to come down to for voters. But I think you're exactly right. National forces are driving this. We talked last week about how Steve Bannon is coming to Texas. That's a national kind of MAGA movement epicenter. You're seeing, obviously, you know, Donald Trump's weigh in on these races have a significant effect on who wins and who loses. He's essentially endorsed in basically every race except for the Senate race and in the CD2, which is Dan Crenshaw's race. So there's basically a pretty strong Trump imprimatur on Republican Party politics, you know, all the way up and down the ballot. So I think this is going to be basically a pretty conservative primary. You've got turnout for Republicans, the conservative Republicans, juiced out by top of the ticket features, essentially the U.S. Senate race. And so I suspect you're going to see basically a pretty conservative turnout. There's always this question about, well, you know, will the kind of more mainstream conservatives show up to vote? Some of them might. It'll certainly be competitive enough that you're going to see turnout increase. But generally speaking, I think you can pretty much count on a conservative wing of the party coming out to vote in these different races. So let's talk about some of these races because there's a lot of interesting ones. Let's start with the U.S. Senate race. We talk about this all the time. Basically, John Cornyn hasn't closed the deal. Ken Paxton is still, to some degree, the front runner here, even though he's got all this sort of ethical baggage. The generational change is real, though, too, because you've got Wesley Hunt saying, look, let's move on from all of this. I'm the choice. What's going to happen here?
Who knows?
but probably a runoff, though, right? Like
for sure.
By then, you know, it's maybe a bit of a toss-up, but edge to Cornyn or edge to Paxton.
I don't know. I mean, the runoff is almost certain unless something weird happens, which
more weird things happen.
More weird, which may be the case.
Right, could be.
But whoever wins, right, is going to be a wounded candidate.
Yeah.
And that could mean a lot of things for the general election. Again, general election under President Trump, 2018 2.0, who knows? Midterm, the economy sluggishly, as you said, unemployment, this and that, etc. It's going to be complicated.
It's going to be a tough road.
Yes.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, I think in general, the edge still goes to Republicans in terms of turnout, in terms of numbers, but there are still some moments here where you could see the Republican nominate somebody who maybe isn't quite the best candidate for a general. But the primary itself, like we're talking about here, does give us a flavor of kind of where the party is going. And definitely the Senate race will be a test of the kind of MAGA movement versus establishment, right? And so far, the MAGA movement's been winning. Establishment candidates have not been successful. I think you're seeing this happen here for John Cornyn. He's too tied to the Beltway crowd. And Ken Paxton, despite all of the limitations of the kind of ethical boundaries, the impeachment, and some of the other investigations, he definitely has emerged from this unscathed. So this would be obviously the marquee race. This is a national level race. We've talked about this all the time. So there's definitely going to be some interesting features there. But let's talk about some races that sort of look a little bit like that race, but that are down ballot a little bit. Obviously, Texas politics is the best politics and local politics is the most interesting. And so let's talk about some of these races, including first up the Attorney General race. This has been a race that for the first time in a decade, there's going to be a new Attorney General, which is pretty surprising. Paxton's legacy, I think, defines the context of this race. Basically, the ideological split within the candidates here is pretty prominent. Trump's endorsement is going to be pretty significant here, and how people are able to convince the voters that they are or are not with Trump. And obviously, money is going to shape this pretty significantly. Polling right now has got Chip Roy ahead of the game, but he's not the only competitor. Aaron Reitz, who's a Paxton-aligned MAGA continuity candidate. He had worked as the deputy AG for Donald Trump. State Senator Joan Huffman is kind of the establishment candidate. She's sort of frames her race as a public safety issue. Like we said, Chip Roy, who's leaving Congress to run, he's a Paxton skeptic, right? He worked with Paxton and then resigned because of some of the unethical things he said were happening inside the office. And then Mays Middleton, who's a culture war conservative. He's a kind of Dan Patrick acolyte. I thought he might run for lieutenant governor down the road, but he's got millions of dollars of his own to pledge on this, and that's going to be pretty impactful. So it's a pretty crowded field of very conservative candidates. What's your take on the AG race?
Well, I mean, it's going to be who is able to put themselves in the position to say, I am the successor of Paxton's conservative legal approach, not of Paxton, I guess, ethical issues, concerns, etc., but the legal strategy, right? That has been, if a Democrat breathes, sue.
We're taking you to court, bud.
Right.
Yeah, no, for sure.
So that's a key point, right? And as you said, you have, these alignment of forces, right? Where Reitz may have the upper hand in claiming, because he has been part of Deputy Attorney General for Texas, so he has been part of the team. So he's maybe the one that has been picked. But then you have the confluence of big political powers, right? And as you say, Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, perhaps supporting Mays Middleton, which goes against Paxton. Having control of that office, at least indirectly, would be very beneficial for the Lieutenant Governor. And then, obviously, Chip Roy just saying, like, this is a disaster. This is not how we should behave. And obviously, Senator Huffman, that brings, I would say, perhaps a more policy-oriented campaign, more as a state woman just
Yeah.
this is
Yeah.
what we should be doing
Yeah.
rather than fighting all these other
Yeah,
stuff.
like focusing on the things that the office does well, which
Exactly.
is to prosecute,
Law enforcement and public safety.
law enforcement. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and to be a champion of that is something that I think would be a sellable point, especially to a general election crowd. In a primary with conservatives, then it's maybe not quite as attractive because they're looking for something more, looking for Paxton plus. I think you're right. Like the office needs to continue to do under their mind like what Paxton was doing, except maybe a slightly different way, right?
Yep.
Make sure you've got kind of some of this in-house, right, where you don't have to outsource some of these legal fights, picking the right battles to, engage in for Texas. So, depending on who the candidates are, there's variety of approaches to this, right? People like Huffman probably would be less inclined to do it. People like Reitz probably more inclined to do it. But kind of strong conservative credentials here are critical, and you see people like Reitz certainly with that, Mays Middleton for sure as well. He's seen as a kind of cultural warrior in the Senate, so definitely you're going to see a lot of that. The problem for Reitz, for instance, is that he's got low name ID, right? And he's kind of a newcomer to this. He's making the case that he's kind of the most Trump adjacent candidate, but people like Chip Roy are saying, well, look, I've worked with kind of Trump and